The Tallgrass Prairie once covered over 400,000 square miles across central North America. As settlers moved west in the 1800s, the Tallgrass Prairie was plowed to make way for agriculture. Today, only small pockets of the Tallgrass Prairie remain. Located on the edge of Lincoln, Nebraska, 9 Mile Prairie is one of the last remnants of this once expansive ecosystem. Owned by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, this 235-acre tallgrass prairie has served as a living laboratory for scientists and students for more than a century, including Dr. Dave Wadeen, an ecologist and history buff, who is the prairie's current manager.
We are about 9 miles from downtown Lincoln, which is why the professors that used to work here in the early 20th century called it 9 Mile Prairie. It's unlikely that 9 Mile Prairie would still be intact if it hadn't been for the military. Around 1950, as the Cold War was warming up, there was a decision to place a Strategic Air Command base here. Some of the legacy of that is this land was never developed. And then just to our north is a strange but compatible neighbor to 9 Mile Prairie, a former nuclear weapons facility.
After being owned by the military for 2 decades, 9 Mile Prairie was leased by the Wachiska Audubon Society for conservation purposes until the University of Nebraska purchased the property in 1983 using generous donations. Generations before, Indigenous peoples lived on and managed the Tallgrass Prairie landscape. Today, Indigenous peoples continue to foster their relationships with the land, including Renee Sanssouci, a member of the Umaha tribe.
From an Umaha perspective or a native perspective, we're part of the land. This is our bodies. We're connected to the land. This is where we came from. We knew every inch of this land and we understood the purpose of everything here. What happened to us was a travesty, because one of the main things that nearly destroyed us is when they separated us from the land. And we still have that connection. We've been rebuilding that connection back to the land.
The Tallgrass Prairie hosts a tremendous diversity of plant and animal life. It is constantly changing, and no 2 trips to the prairie are alike. That constant change is what keeps Chris Helzer, an ecologist and photographer, coming back to the prairie again and again.
I think I discovered prairies and photography at about the same time. When I was looking for natural areas to photograph small things in, around Lincoln, the most obvious places were places like 9 Mile Prairie. What's really special about prairies like 9 Mile Prairie is that there's a lot of diversity happening at a smaller scale. And in some ways it's like a coral reef. If you are going past a coral reef on a boat, it doesn't look like anything because it's just a bunch of water. But as soon as you stop and sort of sink below the waves and start looking, there's this incredible community of life going on. And prairies are much like that. If you kind of stop and sink into it a little bit, You find all these species and all these interactions, all these stories that aren't necessarily evident as you walk or drive past.
Tallgrass prairie is dominated by several species of grasses that can grow well above your head. Tucked within these towering grasses are hundreds of species of wildflowers and other plants that make themselves known at different times throughout the year.
Plant diversity is important for a lot of different reasons. So you have some species that are going to be really good at growing and flourishing in wet years, and you're going to have others that do better in dry years. You're going to have some that can withstand grazing and some that don't like grazing as much. And they can all survive as long as they get what they need every few years. Just from the resilience of the plant community, plant diversity is important. But then you start layering on all the other species that depend on plants. You've got things like regal fritillary butterflies that need violets, and you've got monarchs that need milkweeds. The more plant species you have, the more those relationships can be formed.
Much of the life in prairies is found in the soil. The rich soils of the tallgrass prairie have fueled agricultural production in eastern Nebraska for generations. Andrea Beisch, a soil scientist at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, has a deep appreciation for our soils and the forces that shaped them.
Soil is the living interface of geology, biology, climate, and time. Because we've had tallgrass prairie, we have roots of grasses that are constantly dying and turning over, and that starts the food web of many different organisms that have fed our soil. Because of the climate, because of the native vegetation of prairie, we have some of the richest soils in the world. But this has taken many, many hundreds, thousands of years to come to the place that we are today in terms of the soil. So this does not happen in a day or a week. Soil forms very slowly, so really on geologic timescales.
Humans have always managed prairies. Indigenous people have been using fire in grasslands for thousands of years to attract grazing animals to the fresh growth that follows a burn, and to promote the growth of culturally important plants. This widespread use of fire and grazing shaped the tallgrass prairie ecosystem. And today, land managers continue to use these tools to manage prairies.
One of the lessons that I think all of us in prairie conservation have learned is that grasslands need management. They need periodic disturbance. Okay, mix it up. Burn some, hay some.
If prairies aren't managed, then trees and shrubs can quickly invade a prairie, making it unsuitable for grassland species that require large treeless landscapes. Jordan Springer, a former student land manager at 9 Mile Prairie, has gained first-hand experience slowing the spread of invasive shrubs and trees.
One of the most rewarding things about being out here would be being a part of our major management plan of shrub control right now. So we had a whole 40-acre area that was totally encroached with shrubs, and I was a part of being able to shred those, knock it back. That's reclaiming a huge part of this prairie that's been neglected for a while.
There are efforts underway to restore prairies in eastern Nebraska. Sarah Bailey, the greenhouse manager with Prairie Plains Resource Institute, is involved firsthand in efforts to restore diverse prairies in eastern Nebraska.
We're actually harvesting over 200 species of plants in a given year. And we're creating seed mixes that have anywhere from, say, 75 to even up to 150 species in that mix. I concentrate on things like prairie violets, and they have trouble establishing from seed in prairie restoration sites. We're able to grow those and actually plug the prairie violets in to restoration sites for regal fritillary conservation. A regal fritillary butterfly is a striking butterfly. Historically, they were very common throughout all prairie habitats in central and eastern Nebraska, and they've since declined very sharply, especially in the last 20 to 30 years. Their larvae feed exclusively on violet species, and in prairies, in our region, that's the prairie violet.
Nebraska is predominantly privately owned. In order to conserve large areas of grassland, we need to work on both public and private land. Rich Nelson, a biologist with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, has worked extensively with private landowners to restore grasslands in Nebraska.
While we have areas like 9 Mile Prairie that are in public ownership, they're protected, they're still small, isolated areas. And so by working with landowners adjacent to that throughout this local region, we can build upon that complexity and put those areas into grassland. And for a lot of species, that's important.
We're very dependent on our neighbors and the land use that they have. And I think we've been successful in cooperating with neighbors and encouraging compatible land use.
Nebraska's tallgrass prairies will continue to face a number of challenges. As urban areas expand, our existing prairies will become increasingly fragmented, and climate change will only add to the uncertainty that land managers face. Fortunately, there is a dedicated group of people who are passionate about prairie conservation in Nebraska.
Having a prairie close to town where people can go explore and see for themselves what a prairie is like is just vitally important in terms of raising awareness, keeping prairies in people's consciousness, and reminding them that this is part of the place that they live, and giving them a chance to explore the diversity for themselves.
I'm thinking about all these changes that are continuing to happen and that will happen in the 21st century, and say, how do we manage this grassland to sustain the biodiversity, to sustain the habitat, to sustain the healthy soils, to prevent noxious weeds, to keep it grassland? All those challenges that are just going to get more intense in the 21st century. So we're going to need a cadre of inspired, well-trained grassland conservationists to manage these kind of landscapes, or we're not going to have them.
I'm trying to help people to understand that on their own healing journey, they really need to reconnect back to Mother Earth. And that's to anyone, you know, not only just to Omahas or Lakotas, Dakotas, you know, Ho-Chunk or Ponca people. It has to do with everyone who's living here. Because if they reconnect to the land, then they're going to have a whole different worldview.
There is a lot of hope in restoring grasslands, and I think that it's a way that we can start involving more people and a way for people to actually feel more hopeful about the future in our area of the Great Plains as well.